Good afternoon, everyone. Today is February the 3rd, and this is the Ways and Means briefing on SROs, school resource officers, and security assistants. We have a lot of folks with some great information here for our committee and for everyone who is listening. In the recent years, the Ways and Means Committee has worked repeatedly on issues related to school resource officers and security assistants. And since the beginning of this current term has heard over 20 bills related to this topic. In 2018, the committee passed the Maryland Safe to Learn Act, which transformed the Maryland Center for School Safety and created a statewide created a statewide center for school resource officers and security assistants. In 2020, before I became a member of the committee's education subcommittee heard a briefing by the center on the implementation of the Safe to Learn Act. And every year since 2018, the committee has had numerous bills related to school resource officers, anywhere from increasing funding to shifting funding to support them to removing school resource officers. In addition, the committee hears local bills related to individual jurisdictions and how they should utilize school resource officers and security assistance. So today, we are here to hear from a variety of individuals on the topic of school resource officers and security assistants. This is a topic of importance to me as a legislator and as an African-American woman and the mother of 3 children. And so as someone who would have to worry about this every day with a child who may or may not have to interact with a school resource officer. I think it's also important that this committee take a look at this issue and in the future determine if there is a one-size-fits-all or if there are different needs in different jurisdictions and what's happening in that locality. So I'm happy to have everyone here today. And we are going to start with the Maryland Center for School Safety. So I'd like to welcome Ms. Kate Hennison and Michael Radinsky. And whenever you're ready, you can begin.
Great, thank you. Can you see our slides? Are they up
No,
here?
Not yet. Let us get that situated.
While you're doing that, I will just introduce myself. So Chair Atterbury, members of the committee, thank you for having us today. I am Kate Hessian. I'm the Executive Director for the Maryland Center for School Safety. With me today is Mr. Mike Radinsky. Mike is a school safety emergency preparedness specialist in our training and certification unit. So we have a very short presentation, just a handful of slides. You should have also received a 2-page handout that's going to go through some of the training information related to our 22 revision that Mike's going to go through shortly. Haley, next slide, please. Thank you. So very brief background on the Maryland Center for School Safety, or MCSS, established in 2013, originally a team of 2, established as an independent agency under the Maryland State Police. In 2018, after the enactment of the Safe to Learn Act, MCSS was moved, also remaining as an independent agency, but moved to the Department of Education. We were expanded to a team of 14. So we have 14 individuals now, as well as counsel. And we have the Safe to Learn Act expanded some of the responsibilities of the center. So originally the center was a coordination and collaboration center for local, state, and federal school safety stakeholders. And now we continue to do that, but we have a lot more responsibility. So we do development of various guidance documents, one specifically related to school resource officers. We develop training, which you're going to hear about, one of the curriculum development that Mike's been working on since 2018. We build out, we have a website that has gone through multiple revisions, and it's currently going through a new one, where we're building out some of the resources that we have related to school safety. We conduct school safety training. We do emergency plan reviews. So we collect emergency plans from individual public schools. We review those plans, provide them feedback on those plans. And the Safe to Learn Act also made us a granting agency. So in addition to grants for school resource officers, as the chair mentioned, we also have school safety and security grants for public and private and non-public schools for various school safety security related projects. We also administer something called Safe Schools Maryland. If you're not familiar, it is the statewide anonymous reporting system. So it allows individual students, parents, school community members to report issues of concern, school safety concerns in their school anonymously. So ideally, we obviously want them to report those to the school or a trusted adult, but sometimes they just don't want to do that and they want to be anonymous. And so the statewide system allows a student in any public school in Maryland, they're all the public schools are included. We also have about 200 private and non-public schools as part of Safe Schools Maryland. So it's a really great resource and it's free to all the schools in your jurisdictions. Next slide. So we're here to talk about school resource officers and security employees. So before I turn it over to Mike for training, just for some context. So school resource officers and school security employees are defined in the Safe to Learn Act. So it's the first time a school resource officer has actually been defined in the law. There is an additional definition or expanded definition of school security employees in regulation. So under the subcabinet's regulation. But basically, big difference, school resource officers are sworn law enforcement officers. And with the exception of Baltimore City School Police, they work for their local law enforcement agency. They're employed by them, they report to them. They are trained by them in addition to any training they attend that we deliver. They're assigned to individual schools in accordance with a memorandum of understanding between the law enforcement agency and the school system, and that's a requirement of the law of the Safe to Learn Act. So in contrast, school security employees are civilians. They work for the local school system. They're employed by the school system, report to the school system, are assigned to a school by the school system, and then they also participate in our training, but additional training that might be provided by the local school system. So next slide. So I'm going to pass it off to Mike. Mike's going to go through the school resource officer and security employee training that exists today, the one that we're conducting right now. And he's going to talk about the 2022 revision that's in the process. So Mike.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? All right. So before I start, I'd just like to thank you all for having us here today to talk about this. I'm always happy to talk about our training program and what we do. And the Safe to Learn Act made this all possible, because prior to the Safe to Learn Act, there was no requirement for law enforcement being inside of public schools in the state of Maryland. Now there is. I was called upon to help create this when I was training entry-level police. I'm a retired SRO. I was training entry-level police at the Maryland Police Training Commission. And initially, the Safe to Learn Act highlighted 5 separate areas that required training. They're highlighted in red on this document. We knew as law enforcement officers and as trainers that the SROs needed much more training. The Safe to Learn Act also requires that school security have the same training. That also is paramount, because until that time, I'm not aware of what training school security personnel had. So we took those 5 areas. Excuse me one second, I'm in an operational school, so we may have some sounds that I'm not expecting. So we took those 5 topic areas that were legislated and we expanded on them by contacting members of the community, citizens of the state of Maryland, school officials, teachers. We polled around 1,200 people and asked them what they thought school resource officers and school security needed to be trained in. When we were done, we came up with all of the topics that you have on your screen. Now, we knew as police officers that we were not capable of training law enforcement in some of these topics. They deal with difficult issues like the teen brain, restorative approaches, trauma-informed care. They're just not things that police officers normally at that time had been trained in. So we had to reach out to subject matter experts, and we have been blessed with some wonderful subject matter experts that have been with us since the inception of this program. They developed the training areas, and they actually come out with us and they train all the school resource officers and all the school security in the state of Maryland. Many of those individuals are school psychologists. Experts in the field of restorative approaches, of school discipline, in the areas that you have been concentrating so hard on. Our subject matter experts have been able to provide us with the knowledge and expertise in those areas to begin in September of 2019, having all the SROs and SSEs, school security employees, already trained in those areas. Next slide, please. So every 3 years, the Maryland Police Training Commission requires that any certified program be reevaluated. That is essentially the opportunity to update programs. After much discussion and after hearing last year's legislative sessions and the intent of our legislators, we decided that we could expand our program even more to touch those areas and to give more training in the areas that we know that our communities are concerned with. For that reason, we started exploring ways to do that. We decided that we were going to expand many of the topic areas that we had from an overview to an actual operational level for the trainees. De-escalation, we decided to move from a 2-hour program to a 4-hour program. Disability and diversity awareness, this is a very small slide, that actually is disability and diversity awareness with special attention to cultural fluency. We moved that from 1 hour to 4 hours. Implicit bias, we moved from 2 hours to 4 hours. And the big one, the big change that we had was moving our restorative approaches from 1 hour to 8 hours. We knew that giving the SROs and SSEs the ability to have an operational level with restorative approaches would not only help them in the schools, but eventually moving into our communities. These are practices that they could use forever in dealing with community members. We also introduced new modules, the crime prevention through environmental design. The reason we want this program is because this is a program that shows you how to design facilities to prevent crime. If we prevent crime in the beginning, we don't have to respond to it after it occurs. So the object is to reduce crime. Crisis intervention, we know about the mental health issues. That's actually wrong. That's a 3-hour program. But we know the mental health issues that we're seeing with the community, especially after COVID. And we want our SROs and SSEs to be better able to manage young people in crisis. The dangers of devices, that will talk about everything from cell phones in their hands to social media and internet, and how to respond to those things and what are the current social norms. Data capture, which will just tell them what they have to report to us. Another one of our big topic additions is normalized adolescent behaviors. Let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, adolescents can be a challenge, and it's because of the way that their brain is not developed yet. They understand risk and reward and not so much consequences. Well, we went to subject matter experts in Anne Arundel County Public Schools, and they put this program together for us to teach our SROs and SSEs what to expect from adolescents on a normal day-to-day basis, so they don't mistake it for a criminal behavior. Safe Schools Maryland would be our tip line training, so they learned that. And of course, understanding intellectual or developmental disabilities, which is an autism program. We know that our SROs and SSEs need more training than is allotted to them every 3 years by the Training Commission on these topics, because They spend up to 8 hours a day in a school with young people that may have autism or may have intellectual developmental disabilities. So their period of interaction with them is much greater. They need a deeper understanding. So we reached out to the Pathfinders program who supplied this to us. Next slide, please. Our subject matter experts, as I told you, are key. Here's an example of who they are. The Greater Baltimore Medical Center, they help us, they're safe nurses, with victimization of youth in schools and with child exploitation. The Maryland Department of Education, the Frederick County Public Schools, we have 2 of their members, one's with us here today in this meeting, and they provide us with the restorative approaches, with developmental disabilities, with trauma-informed care, which is a 4-hour block of program. The Montgomery County Public Schools helped with restorative approaches. The Maryland State Education Association, restorative approaches. The Department of Emergency Management provided us with our emergency response for the officers. I told you about Pathfinders. Anne Arundel County Police, Tamika Perkins sits on our restorative approaches and our disability diversity awareness classes. The Office of the Attorney General, of course, our own Dawn O'Cronin Lutke, she sits on our training team and teaches Memorandum of Understanding, Maryland school law, and updates that on a regular basis. Anne Arundel County Public Schools are behavioral threat assessment and normative adolescent behavior experts. And they all come out and train these programs to our trainees. We don't train them, they do it themselves. Next slide, please. This is just a slide that has our training statistics. We were required to have all SROs and SSEs that we were told were inside of public schools trained by September 19th, and we did what we thought, trained them all. We had live training multiple that year in order to achieve this. In 2020, we had to pivot. Of course, COVID hit, that didn't change the law. We still had to train people. So we went to a completely virtual program, which was video-based, and knowledge checks during the videos, accountability regulated by the Maryland Police Training Commission, and there are the numbers. In 2021, we switched to a combination virtual and hybrid. The police chiefs and schools have realized that they don't have to pay to send people to training now. We have the ability to do just what we're doing today, Zoom. So we had a combination of virtual and hybrid training, and we trained the amount of people that are on there. I should let you know that February 15th, we are starting our last training for the current curriculum, the 40-hour program. We're hoping to launch the 70-hour program in April. And just for fresh off the presses, yesterday afternoon, our program has been certified by the Maryland Police Training Commission for 70 hours. So we'll be moving forward with that. And I think that's the last slide.
Thank you. We'll go ahead, committee, if you have questions for these 2 presenters. If it gets long, we might have to cut them off and circle back, but I see Delegate Ivy. And then I also
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I was trying to figure out where the button is. And, to the individuals who just presented, thank you so much for the work that you've been doing. To the gentleman who was just going over how long these training programs last for, the modules, how long does it take, from start to finish to go through the entire training session? Is it 1 day? Is it 3 days?
The current program is 40 hours. It's a 1-week program. The new program will be 70 hours. It will be comprised of a pre-course video portion of 15 hours, followed by 4 days actually of Zoom, followed by 4 days of live training.
Okay, and I assume that there are check-ins throughout the year as well.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm glad you brought that up because I failed to mention it. Our new program adds what was never legislated, but it will be an in-service program. The object for the first in-service program this year, 2022, will be to bring all 1,100 and change people to the level that new trainees are trained with the new program. They'll get all the objectives they didn't get, then we'll be consistent. From that point forward, we'll be providing in-service on a yearly basis.
Mr. Rudensky, thank you so much for your work. Talking to you soon.
Delegate Lasanti?
Thank you very much. And my question goes back to the hotline, if you will, that was described as part of the presentation. Can you give me an idea? Well, first of all, can you tell us what the phone number of where you can make a report like that? What type of reports are, what is the parameters of what can be reported there, and maybe some feedback as to what type of issues are being reported to you and what you do with that information.
Sure, absolutely. So all the information easily can be found on safeschoolsmd.org. So that'll give you the phone number. It'll give you the access to be able to download the smartphone app. So the software, the application allows for phone calls. It allows for a web form, so on a browser, and it allows for a smartphone app to be downloaded on your phone. So you can make a report with any of those three mechanisms. The reports are answered on a 24/7 basis. So the tip takers receive the reports that come through Safe Schools Maryland. They triage the report. So if it's a critical, life-threatening, and/or an issue that requires immediate response, either by local dispatch center or local school system, they make those connections immediately. Otherwise, the system then shares that report to the school system or the school, depending on if it's a public school or a private school, in whatever, to the group that the school or school system has designated to receive those tips. So for example, if a call comes in from a student, it's not an immediate life-threatening situation, the call taker will translate and put that tip within the system. That tip will then be routed to the individual school or school system, depending on how they have it set up. So again, the key things are it runs 24/7. Students and anyone, community members, can report any type of school safety incident, everything from sort of general school safety. I come to school every day and this door is always left wide open, all the way to concerns about individual behaviors. So, I'm worried about my friend. My friend doesn't seem to be acting or behaving the way I expect. I'm concerned that they might hurt themselves. Those are all sorts of communications we receive. As you can imagine, over the last 2 years, we've also started to receive quite a few tips related to COVID. So concerns related to either school systems and or individuals not following the local school systems policies related to COVID. So we got a spectrum of reports and incidents on our website. If you pull down our annual report, you'll actually see a breakdown of like the top 5. We can also provide that to the committee as well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Delegate Hornberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just wanted to drill down a little bit more on this, this information that's being shared between the different groups. Could you tell me how you're protecting what's happening in the schools from anyone on the outside who wants to view this sort of information? It sounds like information is going from the school to a law enforcement group back to the school. Can you just kind of give me the pathway there and how that information is protected?
Sure. May I ask a clarifying question? Are you referring to the reports through Safe Schools Maryland or just in general?
I'm just talking about personal information for the students.
So the system that we use for Safe Schools Maryland is encrypted. It's encrypted at rest and it's encrypted in transit. The school system determines who receives any information that's included within Safe Schools Maryland, so included within a report or a tip. The information, if there is a life-threatening incident, that information of those individuals can be shared with law enforcement in order to protect life and safety of students and or the school community. Does
And
that
is that
question
information archived?
It is. It stays within the system. That is correct.
And then are those archives accessible to anyone after the student graduates?
So that they stay within the system, and yes, they are. They remain in the system indefinitely at this point. The system has only been around since 2018, so we only have data since 2018.
Has there been a review to make sure that the archiving of this information is, I guess, legal here? I mean, we're dealing with disciplinary action, and then we're creating a permanent repository for it, which is accessible by I don't know who later. I'm just, we're in this committee, we deal a lot with longitudinal system, disaggregated information, trend analysis, et cetera. But this sounds like personal information that may or may not be provable. A lot of times these are accusatory actions between students, and then creating a permanent database that is accessible by who knows what in perpetuity. So I just have concerns there.
Sure. So we do have, counsel as part of the agency. We have these conversations on a regular basis about personally identifiable information. We do, although the information is stored in the system as far as the reports, the actions taken by the individual school systems and or schools is not necessarily stored in the system unless that's the decision of the school system to do so.
But it can be.
We don't force sort of the closeout and or follow-up of those tips to be included in Safe Schools Maryland, with the exception of saying they've taken care of it or they've addressed the situation.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, so I see Delegate Long, then Wilkins, then Eversole, and we've got a lot more presenters. Delegate Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was looking at the comparisons between the SRO and the SSE, the chart there. And it seems like to me, and I want to clarify this, the law enforcement agency reports back to the law enforcement or to the law enforcement agency enforcement. And don't they also interact with the schools if there's a problem going on with the principals? Isn't there a lot of interactions with the principals, with the SRO officers?
Yes, that is correct. So the very last on that slide that you're referring to, the left side, so the school system and the law enforcement agency are required to have a memorandum of understanding between them, outlines how the school will interact with those individual school resource officers or law enforcement if there's not an assigned school resource officer. So yes, but their day-to-day reporting, they are employees of the local law enforcement agency. Again, there's a caveat there. Baltimore City School Police report to the local school system, but all the other SROs in the state report to individual law enforcement agencies.
Right. Well, thank you. Go ahead. Yes. I just want to say, I remember back in 2017, when we first started having this conversation with the governor's office, the first thing we started talking about was the ALICE training in Baltimore County and what was happening through the state. And, I'm glad that the state took up this legislation in 18. We only hear nothing but praises from our SRO officers in Baltimore County, how they interact with the students, and they're being ambassadors to the students. And, they're trying to, make things easier for children. They talk to them. I've talked to personally to some SRO officers that's talking to students that were having problems at home and try to work, they get personally involved with them. I don't know how it is with other schools, but they reach out to these kids and they're really doing a fine job. We can only say, the SRO officers in our district are doing a fantastic job. Matter of fact, I wish we had a few more. So that way we could make sure the kids could interact with the police department and not be scared of them. I think a lot of the problems that we're having right now with law enforcement officers, that kids are afraid of the police. And that's the wrong message that we want to have, is children being afraid of the police. When I was coming up, we were friends, we knew our police officer's name. And it made a world of difference because you could stop and talk to that police officer if you had a problem. And I think these SRO officers are doing a wonderful job. And thank you for bringing all this information to us today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I do appreciate the opportunity to ask a couple of questions, Madam Chair, and I do think these questions are most appropriate for these speakers. Thank you all for the presentation. It was very useful and helpful. I do want to ask about a couple of recent incidents that I think that I have seen in terms of school resource officers. I know we just talked a little bit about Baltimore County. I think there was a recent incident in terms of an autistic child being handcuffed. I think in Howard County as well, there was an issue with, I think it was school security, maybe not an SRO, that had assaulted a student. And just a couple of incidents that have been a bit concerning in our state. And I know that you have outlined the training that has taken place. How are we ensuring that it doesn't sound like the increase in training is necessarily always preventing these incidences? Can you just talk about how we're helping to prevent and ensure that things don't get out of hand with these officers that are in the schools?
So I'll begin, and then I'll pass it over to Mike if there's anything he wants to add specific to the training. So the Safe to Learn Act was passed in 2018. So I do need to make it very clear. Mike's been talking about the training that's been put forth since we started in 2019, but it's only been 3 years. So it's been 3 years, and 2 of those years have been during a pandemic. So I would argue that there is an opportunity now, especially with the revision that the team is working on to put forth this year. There's an opportunity for us to expand the training, not just for classroom-based, but the in-service training, which is sort of the annual review of training that we develop and we can provide to local law enforcement agencies and their SROs, as well as the school security employees. There is also some need for the school systems to be able to do assessments within their system of their school security programs, their SRO programs, update MOUs on an annual basis. So those are all things that can be done to move the needle forward and hopefully get us to a point where we are, selecting the right individuals to be in the right schools. We are providing them with training, not just one and done, but ongoing training. And we're doing reviews and assessments of those programs, both at the local and the state level. Mike, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
The only thing that I'd like to add is when it comes to the HR issues of law enforcement and school security, that's up to the school security system and the law enforcement. They do the hiring of those individuals, and they have their own policies and procedures as well. I don't know that there's necessarily statewide policies yet. I know they're working on it for different things like use of force, the police, they're working on that. It's coming about thanks to you all. I don't know that there are for security, but they handle those issues. And the question is very good. As a trainer, that's something that we constantly have to look at. As we know, in every profession, in everything that we do, we can train, and sometimes it doesn't take. So we have to explore things further as well. We try and take a deep look at how SROs and school security get involved with young people to begin with in a school system. We know, and I was a long time SRO, I was an SRO for 17 years. I know that when I went into the schools in 1998, nobody taught the administration at all about what I was or how to work with me. So we all had to figure it out ourselves. And sometimes I think that training the school staff on better how to utilize the SROs and the responsibilities of the SROs versus the discipline responsibilities of the school staff is paramount.
Thank you. And those are such important points. I just have two other questions for you. In terms of, there's a lot of conversation around school shootings and school resource officers being critical in schools for that reason. And I just wanted to understand from your perspective and any research and just any trends that we're seeing in Maryland and things like that, do you see that there is evidence around when it comes to actual school shootings that SROs are either disarming or somehow preventing or things like that?
So again, I'll start. So we have, even in Maryland in 2018 at Great Mills High School, had an SRO that intervened and ended up ending an incident sooner rather than later, unfortunately, with tragic results to Jalen Wiley. Having said that, so let me get my numbers so I have them right for this year. There are only 260 public schools in Maryland this year that have an assigned school resource officer. So there are 1,400 public schools in the state. So there is not a school resource officer in every school in Maryland. There are literally not the human capital resources to be able to do that. The schools that they're in, the individuals are committed. This is an incredible group of people, both law enforcement as well as security. They can't stop something if they're not there. If they are there, there is an opportunity. And I would say that I think the prevention and intervention side, right, the ability for them to identify behaviors of concern, be able to identify children who might be struggling, who might be at risk, who might need someone to talk to. I think having that additional resource in the schools for our students can be of huge value. Again, Mike, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Well, I can speak, from experience first on the amount of guns that I took out of schools and never resulted in a school shooting, and it's substantial. And I was in one school. A lot of times we look at SROs and we apply the rubric that we just talked about, which is what have they done? That rubric is not really what their job is. Their job, of course, is 1% of the time is to intervene in that type of an issue and be the best there is at it. But the majority of their job has to do with building relationships and preventing those situations from ever happening. We're working on tools to assess how to measure what the SROs and SSEs do to be able to prevent those particular things and how often that occurs. From experience, again, I know that happens on a regular basis. Just the mere fact that somebody that you've built a relationship with says, hey, you might want to go check so-and-so because they brought a knife or they brought a gun, and those things are taken care of. And many times they don't go to the level of media where we all hear about them. So I think that, that's paramount. The other problem that we have in assessing all of this and that effectiveness is that prior to 2018, we didn't have a definition of school resource officer. So what that means is we didn't know who all was trained and who wasn't trained. When you have a principal who has a relationship with a police officer in their community, that principal at that time could say, you know what, thank you for coming in here, getting coffee once a week or every day. You're going to be my school resource officer. And that person never received training. But that's how they were classified. And even in reports, they were put down as a school resource officer, not knowing if they were ever trained. So all the statistics that we have prior to 2018, we don't really know the data on to know if they were trained individuals or not. I would submit that trained individuals provide the blanket of security that you need in schools through the relationships to prevent those things from happening to begin with.
Thank you. Appreciate those responses. And I know that there's actually a volume of research on the topic of SROs and prevent whether or not they prevent school shootings. And with you all being sort of our nucleus on this issue, I was hoping that you were going to be able to share what those studies have shown. But if that's something that you can follow up with us on, that would be very, very helpful. This is my final question, Madam Chair. I want to deal with the issue and talk about school arrests a bit. And I want to understand a little bit. I think it's been a tad bit alarming just looking at some of the numbers over the years around school arrests, particularly with SROs and our school security, particularly when we look at race as well. And I wanted to understand sort of as you are training, one of the things that this committee really works on is a school to prison pipeline. How are you sort of training officers on helping to prevent that? You did talk about restorative issues, but we are seeing that students are getting arrested and perhaps getting into the system for a fist fight that maybe could be more of a restorative justice type of approach. So if you can talk about those arrests, paper arrests, I understand is a thing. If you can update us on what paper arrests are, the different types of arrests, and how we are working to ensure that the school to prison pipeline is disconnected. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mike.
So school resource officers are trained first and foremost that arrest is the absolute last resort that they take part in. They're to exhaust every other effort of diversion after the school system deals with school discipline before they even consider arrests. The numbers that I've seen are the same ones you have seen, and yes, they are alarming. When we looked into those numbers and we went deeper and looked into how many diversions took place before incidents ever rose to the level of arrest inside of public schools in Maryland, that also was extremely alarming. There are multiples of numbers of incidents that could have been arrested that never rose to that level of arrest because the security and SROs and school systems were doing the diversions rather than arrests. You're only seeing the cases that actually rose to the level of arrests. And we do, through the restorative approaches program, which I think Janine will talk about in a little bit, and through the disability diversity awareness with special attention to cultural fluency, we address those issues. We actually are exploring this year deeper issues as to preconceived notions of police officers in the history of policing and how it relates to those issues, because we're trying on a constant basis to train our SROs and SSEs better to be able to understand this. For them to understand the normative adolescent behaviors is also extremely important. But as I alluded to earlier, the training of our administration and staff, it's paramount. We know that the majority of SRO involvement inside of a public school is administrator driven. We've seen the statistics from counties, and that comes many times from frustration of our administrators, from them dealing with young people to the point where they are frustrated and they call the SRO, and then they start demanding the SRO to get a person out of the school. And it's hard for us to train the SROs that you just can't do that. You have to tell them that because they're worried about their bosses and they're worried about the school system and they're worried about politics. So to come to those understandings is very difficult. Now, we do provide a program called Understanding the Role of the SRO, which has been taken by a handful of administrators within the state of Maryland. We have provided that to over 18 states because this issue is not germane to Maryland, but we all want to see the numbers reduced, and we want to see the numbers to be more accurate than they are now, and we're working heavily towards it. And we're well aware of the school to prison pipeline, and we're trying to implement programs that better train our individuals on those realities.
So we have 3 more hands up, I see, and then I'll cut the questions off for this panel. We have four more presenters, folks, and I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions for them as well. But I do want to clarify, because Mr. Rudinsky, I think that Delegate Wilkins' question was, what is the difference between a paper arrest and a physical arrest? with handcuffs. And quite frankly, there is no difference. A paper arrest, a juvenile still has to appear in front of juvenile services and still can potentially be adjudicated delinquent, which is what the terminology that they use in those types of proceedings, which basically means found guilty. And you don't have a right to counsel at that initial proceeding for that juvenile. So a paper arrest has severe consequences, to be clear, for any juvenile. Delegate Ebersol.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for arranging this briefing, because this is a really important topic, as we all know. I will say that one of the important things about the training is that we have people in the building who understand they're in a different place than in the community. And the training, I know, it's not a training where you can pass easily at the end. Many officers and school security employees are surprised to find they fail the training at the end because they haven't gotten everything or haven't paid as close attention as they should. So it's got a great deal of efficacy, but I have a question about it. And it should be pretty much a yes or no question. I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but my question would be, are all counties who have SROs and SSEs in their building, are they compliant with the training requirements? I'm not going to throw any particular county under the bus, but generally, are you finding them to be compliant, or are there some that are not complying?
So we are finding that the school systems report the number of school resource officers, which then allows us to understand which of those individuals needs to take training if they haven't already taken it. And at this point, we understand the majority of school systems are compliant, with some confusion around the individuals that serve as school security employees. So again, we have definitions in COMAR that further define what a school security employee is. So, but as we identify any of those issues, we work with the school systems to be able to ensure that they send the individuals that they identify as school resource officers and security employees to training.
So you would say that among the school resource officers, then, among the 200 or so that you said exist, they're either trained or they're scheduled to be trained very soon. Is that right?
That is correct. So, and just to clarify, Delegate, thank you for the question. So there are over 400 school resource officers in the state, but there are only 260 schools that have an assigned school resource officer. So some resource officers cover more than one school, so they're not technically assigned.
So you think you can get the SSE thing straightened out? Because I really think if somebody's going to be in there, they need to have this training. The difference between being in the community and being in a school, as you know, and Mike knows so well, is significant. So thank you.
Delegate Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple questions. So, as someone who was a pretty troubled youth, foster kid, no parents at home, I got into my fair share of fights in school, right? And we don't want kids who are just being disagreeable or troubled at home, who are getting into traditional kid incidents at school to be criminalized for it, right? If that happened to me, I wouldn't be here today. That's why I like what Delegate Washington is doing with the bill, trying to draw a bright line between what an SRO can and can't do in school. I think that's important to differentiate that. My first question is related to the point you made that, which interesting point that you haven't had a full year to even implement this, because 2019 was ended early because of COVID. 2020 was almost exclusively virtual, and it's been a hybrid and a mishmash this year in a variety of ways. But I've heard anecdotally there's been an increase of violence in school and intensity in those violence incidents. And obviously you don't have any data yet because we don't have the report, but do you have any anecdotal information of how kids are coming out of the lockdowns and re-entering the school situation and getting along? And have you seen more incidents where SROs are legitimately needed in schools with some of these incidents?
The short answer is yes. So I'll let, there's a couple of other presenters today who can speak to what's going on in the individual schools or school systems, but the answer is yes. I mean, the COVID was extremely challenging. Our kids were not able to go to school, so they lost some of their social skills. coming back. We have, again, anecdotally, heard increases of violence that are happening in individual schools, and just increase of behaviors, right, where they're just overly animated or overly defiant. So yes, we have heard that. We don't have any specific data to tie to that yet, but it is certainly something that we are discussing with our school safety partners across the state, not just our school resource officers, but also our school safety coordinators that are at the central office level, our mental health coordinators that we work with on a regular basis, and really the entire school safety community. So it is an ongoing conversation that we're having with all of those groups.
Thank you. And very briefly, my last question is, again, personal experience, I think, matters for all of us, and as legislators, it really matters, and it's important to have open conversation. So I have an autistic son, 7-year-old, in Harford County Public Schools, and he's nonverbal, and he's going to be a big kid. He's a kid who occasionally has physical outbursts that aren't violent, but they appear violent because he has to just get energy out. And if an untrained eye would think he's being violent. And I hear certain individuals testify occasionally that having school resource officers is a detriment to kids with autism. And me and my experience and with the experience of those in the disabilities community in my county, we've had these conversations. We feel it'd be more secure to have someone, who is law enforcement in the school, who knows my child's circumstance, situation, and what makes him unique about being autistic, because every kid with autism is pretty unique, right? So, but I've heard that there's a liability there. I'm of the opinion that it's good to have someone who knows my kid is on the spectrum and has these outbursts, versus a police officer coming from the outside and responding to an incident, not knowing my kid and treating him as he is neurotypical. So can you speak to a little bit about that training and how you're making sure that SROs understand how to deal with kids that are special needs?
Yeah, so as I said, this year we've expanded that. We actually have the experts from the Pathfinders program coming in. We know that is paramount. Police officers in the state of Maryland all police officers are currently required to go through training on intellectual developmental disabilities every 3 years. We're doing our training in addition to that. So they'll get an additional 4 hours training that is actually tailored towards them being around individuals that may have intellectual disabilities for an 8-hour period. Now, when you look at that picture globally, rather than just confine it to the school, when we talk about the individuals that have IDD that go out into the community, when the police officers hear that name on the radio, or when the police officers know that address, they can easily give a call to the responding officers, explaining situations to them, which globally reduces the incidence as well. So we know that that's very important. They're going to be trained on the de-escalation. They're going to be trained on triggers. We actually had at our conference a mother of an autistic child who speaks in the state of Maryland. She did such a fantastic job. And I talked to the Pathfinders and I said, I want you to include her, because she did video interviews with her son, where one of them was about the young boy jumping out of a car in the middle of an intersection. And she talked to him about her facial expressions and why he jumped out of the car. And she said, but I was smiling. And he said, your eyes were not smiling. And I think it's paramount for our security and our SROs to have that type of deep understanding of people that have IDD or any type of special needs, so they make the proper decisions and they work with the individuals. When I was in a public school, I had to sign a paper saying that I was told about the individuals in our school that were in those situations. I don't know if every school system does that, but I specifically had to do that, and our security team as well did.
Okay, Delegate Rose.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, Delegate Griffith covered my main question was your feedback now that kids are back in school. I will just say, and I'm wondering if you compile any positive data on the interactions of the SROs within our school system. I know in Carroll, they are very popular. In fact, we had an incident, and I think this is something I just wanted to bring up, the positive interactions of a young child that was in our Century High School who was having a choking incident, and our SRO intervened and was able to save his life. And he is so beloved by that school, not just for that one incident, that they asked him to be their graduation speaker. So I'm just wondering if there's any compilation of the positive interactions. And also, I do appreciate this this presentation, and I'm very impressed with the training that you're doing and the expansion, and I really thank you for that overview.
Okay, I just have a couple of questions and then we'll move on to our next group of presenters. So the MOUs between the police departments and the different school jurisdictions, are they uniform across the state, or does each have a different MOU depending on the jurisdiction and the police department?
So short answer is they are not necessarily consistent across the state, but there are components that are consistent across the state. So there are in the SRO guidelines that we put out that are provided to the school systems and law enforcement agencies, as well as the training that Mike was talking about. One of the areas of the training is the memorandum of understanding. So we talk about the components that are necessary within those MOUs. But there is not, if you're asking if there's a standardized template, there is not currently a standardized template across the state.
I was just wondering because there has been a lot of discussion about the SRO's role within the school, and some see it as a mentoring role. Speaking just for here in Howard County, the MOU, it says that they have a police function. So their function is to specifically police the schools. It is not to be a mentor, to develop friendships, to provide mental health assistance and do all those things that they don't necessarily have training for. So I was wondering if there was some consistency related to mentoring actually in the MOUs. You had mentioned, Mr. Rudinsky, you had said that trained individuals provide a blanket level of security for the students in the school system. And I'm kind of concerned about that. And I'm concerned, and I want to make sure there isn't a false sense of security, because I know we had a security assistant out here in Howard County who, I guess in theory, had gone through all of this training. And yet and still a video went viral where he was being held down by an administrator, an SRO, and the security assistant. And while he was not moving, and I'm not saying his behavior was great, I think, but for the security assistant's actions, it would have been fine, but he was beaten by the security assistant and his hair was being pulled. And it was a pretty horrific thing to witness on a Friday night when you come home and the community members are calling you. So I just want to, I think it's fantastic that this training is being expanded, but I don't think that it seems as if that is providing a false sense of security for people. And we just want to ensure that everybody is actually undergoing that training. And that wasn't really a question. It was kind of a rhetorical statement. I spent 7 years on judiciary, so I apologize. And finally, the SROs, they are in fact, I'm looking at the chart here, which this is incredibly helpful PowerPoint. So thank you specifically to me because I was new to the committee. The SROs, they are in fact trained by the law enforcement, by the Maryland Police Training and Standards Commission. So they're receiving your training and the police training. Is that correct?
So in order to be an SRO, you must be trained as a police officer first. The Maryland Police,
there is some, we just went through this huge police reform process here in the state of Maryland, and there's some problems with that training, and there's some problems with folks not being trained on certain issues. There's some problems with folks not using the de-escalation. So I just want to also, just because an officer has in theory gone through that training doesn't mean that they're necessarily using the best practices when they're in their school systems with our students. So I just kind of want to throw that out there. But
Would
I
you like
do-
me to complete my answer to your previous question?
yep,
They're trained by them, but then the Maryland Police Training Commission defers all the school-based training to our agency. So we provide the school-based training, and we also double up on the training that they've had, because yes, we're aware of your situations, as in every profession. When you have people that are trained, you don't always know that that training is going to come out exactly as you want. We wish we could do that. Thank you.
but is it fair to say at the end of the day, their function, they are police officers and their function in the school is a policing function?
So a policing function, I was a trained community police officer before I was ever trained as an SRO. My function as a police officer was community building and community relationships. So when you use the term police function, there's a wide array of what that could mean. So yes, their function is a police function, but that doesn't mean that it's a function to do arrests or things that you think are negative as police. It's a function to do what police officers are trained to do as a whole, and there's a myriad of things.
Okay, I think that's probably where we need to look at the MOUs and see what exactly their function is. Because if it just simply says they're a policing function in the schools, you know, that's not in there, that they're to do all these other flowery and wonderful things. So with that, we are going to move on. Thank you, Mr. Willems, for being very patient, and Karen Bailey, I will turn it over to you. Thank you for sitting through this and being patient with us.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. John Willems, representing the Maryland Association of Boards of Education. Pleased to be here today to present to the committee MABE's perspectives on the role of SROs, school resource officers, and other civilian staff providing school security functions. MABE continues to support the flexibility, local discretion provided to local boards of education and to their communities under current law, specifically the Safe to Learn Act, passed in 2018, which provides that flexibility to either assign SROs to individual schools, otherwise provide for law enforcement coverage of those schools, and certainly the pre-existing authority to have civilian school security staff available in schools. And to be clear, when we talk about local flexibility, we strongly opposed proposals at the time to mandate a phasing in, for instance, of one SRO in every high school, and then every middle school, and then every elementary school. We felt that that certainly violated the principle of local control and discretion in terms of staffing in the area of school safety and security. Prior to the passage of the Safe to Learn Act, but certainly efforts and activities ramped up following that, and since then, MABE provides a forum for the statewide school security directors group. They meet, they used to meet regularly in person here. They meet via Zoom. We provide that forum for their sharing of best practices, concerns, experiences, and their insights into some of the issues that have been discussed today, particularly around the definition of arrest. And while MABE, as this committee knows better than anyone, typically opposes one-size-fits-all approaches, there is I would say, a rising level of concern about the apples and oranges facets of the way arrests are defined and processed at the local level by different local law enforcement agencies, county and municipal. And that is an area that we would definitely look forward to further discussions with the center and MSDE and representatives of local law enforcement to ensure that as we look to expand practices such as pre-arrest diversionary programs, that someone's best practice and experience with that program is able to inform other jurisdictions and other systems and potentially statewide efforts. The Safe to Learn Act passed in 2018, while it was in response to some mass school shootings at the national level and tragic local events in St. Mary's County. It was a team effort of mental and behavioral health specialists, school administrators, school board members, bipartisan legislators, all involved in bringing everyone to the table and really working to craft legislation that, for instance, required us to designate not only a school safety coordinator, but also mental health services coordinator. And so we really felt that we were taking a holistic approach to addressing both student behavior and discipline issues and school safety and security issues. I like to point out that we have two completely separate legislative policy and position statements in the booklet that we provide to every legislator every year. We draw a bright line distinction between student behavior and discipline and school safety and security. They are not the same thing and should not be confused. We do support the training program and the expansion of that training program. We also support the expansion of who may be either encouraged or required to participate in that training program. We have worked closely with representatives from the associations of the secondary school principals and elementary school principals, for instance, and their buy-in, not here today to speak on their behalf, but their buy-in for a move toward more routine training of school administrators in this area. And I would place Board of Education members in that group as well, who certainly, as they're adopting system-wide school safety and security policies and student discipline policies, need to be informed of, I think, many of the components of the SRO training program. And so you will be hearing in a minute from MABE's representative on the advisory board established by the Safe to Learn Act. I know Delegate Ebersol is also a member of that advisory board. And again, it represents a holistic cross-section of advocates and individuals to inform state policy in this area. We support also improvements in the clarification in the law between student discipline and student arrests or any role of law enforcement to take those actions on school premises. We've certainly supported legislation sponsored by Vice Chair Washington in the past, and we worked diligently and certainly in good faith at the end of last session on legislation which would have mandated a significantly new and expanded role at the school level for a team of school administrators, school security staff, behavioral health staff to develop a safety and health plan for each school. And while we are sometimes loath to take on major new tasks proposed by legislation, there's a lot of merit to the model that Vice Chair Washington was pursuing in that legislation. Again, in conclusion, our top legislative priority for this session is local governance authority of local boards. We do emphasize that is always in the context of federal and state law, the policies and guidance provided by the State Department of Education, our partnerships at the state and local level, and that certainly applies in the area of school safety and security. But we do support preserving the local flexibility provided in the Safe to Learn Act so that when we do at the local level, in partnership with our local governments and funding authorities and local law enforcement agencies, adopt policies to place SROs and school security staff in schools, they are highly trained and, Madam Chair, trained in that holistic manner, not just as officers of the law. Lastly, to just pick up on two questions that were raised earlier, school systems can share student discipline records with other entities, but those other entities have to be legally defined as school officials or meet a couple other exceptions under FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. And any entity that we share information with has to behave basically just as there are agents. They have to maintain the confidentiality of that student's personally identifiable information, and all of the record retention standards apply to those records. And so that's the way in which, from the longitudinal data center to local law enforcement agencies, can obtain this information, but there are very strict privacy requirements and record retention requirements around those records. So wanted to emphasize that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Willems. Next, we have Karen Bailey.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As John mentioned, I am on the advisory board to the School Safety Subcabinet, which, as you know, was created by this Safe to Learn Act of 2018. And I'm currently the chairperson of the Board of Education for St. Mary's County. So hopefully I can give you a little bit of a local perspective on how our program works and answer any of the questions that you might have. So in St. Mary's, our student population is around 18,000 students. We have a very good working relationship and partnership with our sheriff's office. We have SROs at each of our 4 middle schools and our 3 high schools. In addition, we also have school safety and security team members that complete our school safety teams. I'm also going to add, I am a parent, so I have a daughter who is in high school and a son who is in middle school. So I am not naive as to, how it operates, just from a parent perspective as well. I will speak a little bit about our MOU. I know there have been several questions about that. Our MOU is very specific and defining. It has enabled us to develop an excellent relationship with our sheriff's office, and it bounds everything and binds everything that is within our schools. Some of the things that it covers is the purpose and goals of the SRO program, administrative responsibilities, and by this it could be clarification of the employing agency, program costs, workspace, the SRO roles and responsibilities, including their duties within the schools. I probably have about 3 pages of duties of what we are expecting them to perform while they are there. It covers SRO selection, training, supervision, and performance evaluations. So we feel that our SRO role is very clearly defined in this document. It enforces the role as a classroom teaching resource and an adjunct staff member in law-related areas and provides informal counseling and mentoring to our students. It also provides support to our safety and security personnel and provides patrol presence and crime and disorder prevention in and around our schools, including after-school activities, and at the high school level, obviously, our sporting events. As my fellow advisory board members will attest during our meetings, I'm a huge proponent of a solid memorandum of understanding and the collaborative working relationship between the school system and the local law enforcement office. Our superintendent and our sheriff meet frequently to discuss the program. There is a dedicated, I believe that she's a sergeant who runs the SRO programs within our county. We don't necessarily have the same SROs in the schools year after year after year. We may move them around. And then within the past years and after COVID, we've also expanded the meetings between the sheriff and the superintendent to include our county health officer, because we are seeing more behavioral health challenges within our schools and how we can better support those students. Our SROs establish relationships with our students. So if there's a threat, a bullying incident, a need for a wellness check, or any other issue that requires law enforcement, we have the benefit of our SRO and their knowledge of the student situations and the family life to assist us in working through what could be a very uncertain time for both the parents and the student. And that kind of leans to the point that Ms. Hessian was making as calls come in through, the school safety center. If we do have someone that, needs assistance, then we have an SRO. We kind of have a background possibly on that student to help us get them the services that they may need. Let's see. In addition to the training that the Maryland Center for School Safety provides, we also provide local training, and it's done through the Crisis Prevention Institute, and that our school safety staff do that training along with the SROs. And that teaches them specifically how to respond to a crisis, what the decision-making skills are to match the level of response during the crisis. It demonstrates safe physical interventions in various scenarios, and it emphasizes that physical intervention is a last resort and should be correlated to the level of risk of the incident. So our intent is to provide our staff with the best possible tools to keep the student and staff safe within our schools. I will take a moment just to talk about the advisory board. So our board members come from various geographical areas across the state. different state agencies, different law enforcement areas. We have private school representation on the board. We have bus driver representatives. We have mental health professionals. We have a student representative, and the insight that they've provided over the past 2 years has been incredibly valuable because, they're living what we are trying to, create and protect them for on a daily basis. Kate and her staff bring a variety of topics from the subcabinet to the advisory board. And then we have very active roundtable discussions on topics. And it does include SRO training, behavioral supports, school security budget needs, and even bus safety. So the cross-section of the board members on the subcabinet, I think, does give the School Safety Center a good basis as to all aspects of our students and what they may need from safety, mental health aspects, things like that.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. And I see there's a question from our Vice Chair Washington.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the presenters, the previous presenters and our current presenters. Mr. Rudensky, good to see you as always, sir. John, first, I want to just clarify something you said. Was that, did you just give me a compliment earlier about something, about a bill that I had? I just wasn't sure. Just wanted to make sure that that's what you did.
Absolutely, Mr. Vice Chairman, for the record and repeatedly, yes. And
that's why I'm just joking.
But you've been on point in terms of distinguishing between the SRO's role and the student discipline functions of the school administrators.
I was not fishing for compliments. I'm just calling you out for being positive, and I appreciate that. I really want to ask a very serious question, and maybe the folks later can answer this. And I guess, what's the problem right now with requiring all administrators to go through the similar training as we indicated before, and the things that we talked about, Mr. Williams, in last year's legislation that I sponsored, to go through the training to be able to say, this is how, as you said, this is how to respond to a crisis, but also this is the use of SROs and the role of SROs, and this is the role of security personnel, so that teachers and administrators are not calling SROs and security personnel into the classroom for typical behavior of students.
Well, Mr. Vice Chairman, on one level, training is costly, right? So the seat time for an administrator of 40 to 70 hours of training, or some subset of that, or some distinct training tailored to their role. There will be a cost to developing that training and to the seat time for those highly paid professionals who, I will say, are certainly watching today. And whenever I interact with them, it typically is on a Saturday morning, because they are working tirelessly to return students to in-person learning following the COVID shutdowns. And so we have to recognize that any mandate for expanded training of our school staff will come at a cost. So certainly state funding to support that would be greatly appreciated.
Yes, I appreciate that. And, obviously we want to see our teachers and administrators trained more. So I'm sure the Appropriations Committee would accommodate that, and all the money from the federal government that's coming to our school systems will be able to accommodate that as well. So there's ways to do it. But let me go to my next question, which is about the advisory board. The advisory board, I heard something about, is that advisory board looking at eliminating the school-to-prison pipeline, looking at ways to decrease arrests in schools? It seems like it's mostly advisory on training and other pieces. I heard some mental health work too for students, but just talk to me about the role of this advisory board on eliminating the school-to-prison pipeline and reducing arrests in schools.
So, Kate, I'm going to pass it off to you after I speak, because, Kate runs the meetings along with Superintendent Arlotto from Anne Arundel County. The task of the advisory board is to advise the subcabinet. So through the course of our meetings over the last 2 years, a lot of our discussions have centered on questions that the subcabinet have, that they have brought up to us on what they can do and to help to help school safety and mental health needs within the schools in Maryland. So during the course of our meetings, the School to Prison Pipeline does come up. We do have a variety of discussions, and a lot of that then has gone back into changing and centering how the training has been completed. And to make sure that the SROs understand, the complete child, what their issues may be, and maybe an arrest is not necessary at the end of an incident. So it's the advisory board does cover a large variety of topics, and that has been part of our discussions over the course of the last 2 years.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So it's been part of the discussions, but not one of the main focuses of the group. Can I characterize it that way?
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah, and Vice Chair, if I can just add, so as a reminder, so 2018 was the passage of the Safe to Learn Act. So with that came a lot of development of stuff that did not already exist.
Mm-hmm.
So the development of determining how to collect data, how to develop the training and deliver the training statewide to a large number. We are a small agency, right? We're a small team of 14. So the sub-cabinet was getting advice from the advisory board on regulation development, policy development. We developed the statewide behavioral threat assessment policy. I mean, so there was a large sort of cross-section of stuff over the last 3 years of us getting everything up to speed and running. So we're now sort of moving into the next phase of how do we assess our programs? How do we ensure that we're doing the right things? And how do we improve school safety to include arrest data and the school to prison pipeline?
Okay, Delegate Lukey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Willems, you'll recall prior to the passage of the Safe to Learn Act, this committee passed legislation that limited suspensions and expulsions in the early grades as a way to, frankly, one of the major drivers behind that legislation was reducing disproportionality as well. But it seems to me the larger issue underlying all of this is just a basic disproportionality within school discipline generally. And so I'm curious, first of all, do we know how many of our school systems have made the use of restorative practices a fundamental part of their discipline policies and their training for staff in responding to disciplinary issues in the schools?
Delegate Lutke, I do not. Okay. And I would say to complement Ms. Bailey's response to the question about the role of the advisory board and the school safety subcabinet, MABE has, it's been too long since we've had a concerted effort in collaboration with MSDE in particular to look at the relationship of the student records, student discipline, FERPA, and the role that arrests are playing. And so we did adopt comprehensive student discipline reforms in regulations, which of course have the force and effect of law, but that was 2014. And there just has not been a lot of work done since then in an intentional way to bring stakeholders together and to update one another and kind of develop maybe a fuller, more holistic implementation of those policies and programs. So I did want to highlight that. That is work that we would certainly be excited about participating in.
Okay, that's great. One of the complaints you heard from administrators and teachers after the passage of that suspension and expulsion law, and you've heard it since, is that the rule got handed down, and the intent was that school level staff would get additional support, and then teachers and administrators were saying they weren't getting additional support. And I don't know whether that was ever resolved through the boards and through central offices. So that's why I asked that question. I'd love to know if you're able to ask the systems, like, have they incorporated that as part of their discipline policy? That would be very helpful.
I can certainly follow up, Delegate.
Great. Delegate Lukey, from our perspective, in St. Mary's County, we've had restorative practices in place, I believe, 2 to 3 years prior to the pandemic. And in my interaction with other board members across the state, I would have to say that the majority of the counties use that as well. It is really one of the primary focuses in education prior to the COVID shutdown. And in our county, in addition to providing the training to the teachers, we also have done outreach programs with parents within the community so they understand what the restorative practices are that their children are going through while they are in the schools as necessary. And they have been very well received at the majority of our schools and our parents as well. So, it's probably a little bit more of a challenge to handle restorative practices right now because of the behavior. And this is going back to, I believe, Delegate Griffith's question about, what's happening in our schools right now. And it is difficult. It is difficult for our staff and our administration and our students because we were fortunate enough, we opened up our schools in March of last year, but some of the school systems didn't. And, it has been a struggle. So, we're trying to get everything back to some type of normal platform for these students.
Can I ask also, Mr. Willems, this issue of arrests has come up, and it's a very important topic, I think, to all of us. As a parent, if my kid is attacked in a school, right, for whatever reason, regardless of what the school has, do I have the right then to ask for charges to be filed against that kid who attacked my child?
Yes, absolutely. And that is that is an issue on which we just have no information. So the student arrest data that is reported are these big block numbers, and we don't have a good process to be more specific about what is generating those numbers and what practices could help reduce those numbers or better inform what they mean really in terms of who's initiating that arrest. And so that is a collective concern among our school security directors that we are very much interested in working on. And we haven't over the last couple of years, and very excited about the new leadership at MSDE. I want to be clear, but the prior 2 years, it was a little too much radio silence from the department on this issue, to be quite frank.
I'm a big fan of the new superintendent as well. I think he's doing a fantastic job. But so we don't have that data at all. We don't know right now how many of these arrests are driven by parents versus an SRO or another officer making the decision independently. We just don't know.
I don't believe we know. Some of it is because the coding is unique and distinct from county to county and from local law enforcement agency to agency. But a lot of it is probably because no one has asked. No one has or insisted in your role on that data being gathered in a more transparent way.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
I just have 2 follow-up questions and we'll move on to the next presenters. Mr. Willems, I just wanted to get your opinion. So there's been conversation during this briefing that there's an increase in incidents at schools, an increase in violence because kids, have this huge change. They've been at home for so long, and I've certainly heard from, as well as my colleagues, I'm sure, from the school psychologists who say, in fact, they can't even do their jobs. They're just responding to crisis after crisis. So I just want to know, in your opinion, is the response to that an increase in individuals who can help with the mental health of children and can help with that, or is that an increase in SRO's presence in the schools? What's the path that we should be looking at?
Well, I'll go out on a limb here, and not just because I'm the son of a school psychologist, and give you the mental health professional answer. The licensed clinical social workers and school psychologists and counselors can play pivotal roles. We cannot find enough of those folks to fill vacancies. We couldn't afford to pay enough of them to meet the needs. We need to develop partnerships with community providers of those services, find expanded roles for them to come to school sites and provide services there, and to connect parents and guardians and families with accessible, affordable services in that area. And so that's my answer to that very important question.
Thank you. And in response to our majority leader's question, that some of that data does exist, and I'm happy to get it to the committee. In 2018 to 2019, out of 3,141, there were 3,141 arrests, 2,628 of those were by SROs. So I'm happy to share any data points that I have with the committee. But thank you, Mr. Willems, and thank you, Ms. Bailey, for being patient and sticking with us. Next, we are going to move on to Michelle Hall from the Office of the Public Defender and Ms. Monisha Sherrill with the Education Stability Project Public Justice Center, and we'll take questions after both of them have presented for both of them. So Ms. Hall.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you all for having me, Michelle Hall from the Office of the Public Defender. I had a PowerPoint. Sarah, Haley, if y'all can put that up. And so I guess while they're putting that up, I'll just start by saying in my career, I started as a trial attorney in Prince George's County in juvenile court. And one of the things that immediately stuck out to me in my practice were how many school-based cases where I was representing young people where when I was in school, this simply would not arise to the level of being prosecuted. It was incredibly clear that the presence of police in schools drove increased arrests and referrals for that type of conduct. Now, though I represent, and I'm going to focus on what happens to kids when they are prosecuted for school-based offenses and how they end up in juvenile court, that is only a small portion of kids who are impacted by the presence of school police. And we've touched on this a little bit before, but I did have a video on the next slide regarding the arrest of the handcuffing of an autistic student in Baltimore County by school police officers, school police officers. So if we can play about the first 2 minutes of that. I don't think the audio is coming through. I think you have to specifically share the audio. Well, I don't know if other people can hear, but.
Haley, we can't hear that.
Can you hear it now?
No. We can watch this and send it around to the committee.
And so just to narrate a little bit about what is happening, this is Jerome Liaison. He was a student at a middle school in Baltimore County that was specifically chosen by his guardian because he is an autistic student and because of the support at that school. And so very early in the school year, there was an incident where he felt he was being bullied by another student and became incredibly upset, was taken by a staff member to this de-escalation room, but he was still struggling. And so ultimately the staff persons called the school police officer to the school who handcuffed Jerome, and he was handcuffed for 23 minutes. His wrist was broken as a part of this interaction. And at the end, his aunt describes, I think, really poignantly, and I hope you all will take the 3 minutes to watch this later, about the ways that has impacted him in his relationship with police in the community going forward. She specifically says, when they go to Walmart, he stays in the car with his uncle because he does not, he is afraid of interacting with police going forward because of the consequences of this interaction. So we can go to the next slide. And again, I can send that link so you all can have a chance to view that on your own. So, there are certainly a broad range of collateral consequences when we have police officers in schools. I think as demonstrated in Jerome's story, there is always a risk of physical harm because officers are authorized to use force and can use force in incidents such as the one of an autistic student who is having a moment that is part of, again, their expression as an autistic young person. Youth also having a feeling of being demeaned, fearful of police, and criminalized, as so many of my clients have expressed to me, and also as, again, Jerome explains at the end of that video. And finally, we have increased arrests for trivial student behavior and low-level offenses. And the data has shown again and again that because officers are in schools, there's simply an increased number of arrests, referrals for behavior that is part of typical adolescent development. Anytime a young person is arrested, their chances of dropping out of school doubles. And if they have to appear in court, that actually quadruples. And so even the fact of being arrested, separate from being adjudicated or found involved, can increase those dropout rates quite dramatically. When a young person is being prosecuted in juvenile court, there are an incredible amount of times when young people have to come to court, missing school, missing work for their parents, and so being further behind. There's always a risk of detention or electronic monitoring for any offense. And I do think there can be an assumption that because maybe a school, some of these lower level school-based offenses do not carry that same type of weight, but anytime a young person is in juvenile court, there's always that risk. And then finally, after an adjudication, aside from obviously the consequences of being placed on probation or placement, that a finding of involvement in juvenile court can in fact affect one's ability to get a driver's license. It does have immigration consequences, can have adverse immigration consequences. Something that happens for a lot of young people that I think we don't think about is, if you have maybe a joyride or two and you are 14 or 15, but now you're 25 or 26 and you are a security officer and you want to apply for a firearms license because of that as part of your job or something like that, you're actually precluded from doing that up until the age of 30 because of those juvenile findings. And it can impact young people's ability to enroll in the military, having a juvenile finding of involvement. Next slide. We talked a little bit, and I'm glad we touched on and really collapsed that there is no distinction between a physical arrest and a paper arrest for juvenile court purposes, because ultimately they end up in the same place in juvenile court. I was looking at some of the statistics earlier, and this Maryland MSDE does, indicate the number of arrests by police officers for school-based offenses. And I'd also point out in the Department of Juvenile Services data, over 90% of all referrals, so not just school-based referrals, but 90% of all referrals are from police, including SROs, and only 2% come from that citizen complaint component, so a parent filing a complaint against another student for something that did or did not happen in school. And so again, police are driving, and school police are driving many of those arrests. I'd also point out, one of the large concerns I see in my practice in terms of paper arrests is that there is not necessarily a nexus between a school police officer believing that this young person is posing a danger such that, or there is a need for immediate intervention such that they need to be referred to juvenile court. But oftentimes kids are referred to juvenile court as a matter of paperwork. So I would routinely see at the end of the school year, the school police officers sending off a stack of arrest reports that were compiled throughout the year. And now we have young people who are facing the adverse consequences of juvenile court for conduct that clearly no one believed needed juvenile court intervention. And they're facing all of those adverse consequences as a matter of routine paperwork. Next slide. We've talked a little bit about, what students are arrested for. And so I would note that, in the 2018-19 school year, there were less than 10 arrests for firearms in school, 11 for other guns, and then only 7% of the overall arrests were for other weapons. And so really one of the major drivers of school-based arrests are things like fights, property offenses, and disruption. And we touched a little bit on the disproportionality. And so, the slide has some of the data here that Black students comprise a third of the student population, but are majorly overrepresented in terms of suspensions and arrests. And also that's the same with students with disabilities. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that the main driver of that are subjective offenses. And those, by that, I mean, a lot of the disparities result from inconsistent adult responses to various behaviors and not because of the conduct of students. And so the biases of adults are playing out in discipline and arrest responses. And so as was written in the Maryland School-to-Prison Pipeline Commission report, right, it's not that Black students behave worse, but that because of the biases that adults are bringing to the table, their behavior is interpreted as worse, right? And so I think this is a helpful way to think about it. If you look at possession of drugs and controlled substances, this is from the 2019-2020 school year. So that's an objective offense, right? Either a kid has drugs or they don't. You'll see that Black students were arrested proportional to their overall enrollment in the school system. But something subjective, like disruption, that's where you see Black students being overrepresented in school-based arrests. And so we see that so much of what is driving school-based arrests and the disproportionality are these subjective offenses, where again, we're seeing conduct and behavior that is part of typical adolescent development and students being criminalized for that. And my last slide, and then my colleague Monisha will speak more about some of the other solutions that we would propose. But I would just say, I think that there's a conception that school police officers can help refer students to services, and that part of the Department of Juvenile Services and Juvenile Court is to provide services to young people. And simply put, and I think we're having a lot of important conversations about this session, is that the juvenile justice system is just not equipped to be a mass service delivery system. And we have a lot of kids in the system right now who quite frankly do not need to be involved, should have been diverted long ago. And instead we are spending resources and time on supervising those children when other kids could benefit from that support and would benefit from that support. This graphic is actually from the Annie Casey Foundation and their proposal about, why we need to divert more young people and have more kids who actually need supports and services involved in the juvenile system. And so I would just close and say that what we see and what the data nationally and locally makes clear is that having police officers in our schools is a main driver of having so many young people who do not need to be system involved pushed into the system. So I look forward to answering your questions along with my colleague Monisha, and I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Monisha.
Yes, thank you so much. I also have a PowerPoint. It's the one I sent you yesterday, if that can be pulled up. And while that's being pulled together, I'll just introduce myself, Monisha Chirail with the Public Justice Center. I'm an attorney. I represent students in special education proceedings and discipline cases statewide. You can go to the next slide. So I want to back up to a fundamental principle underlying the entire school policing debate, which is just that we all want our kids and our schools to be safe, right? I think that's something we can all agree on. And what's equally clear is that there are a number of proven, effective non-policing strategies that schools can use to accomplish that goal. I'm only going to scratch the surface, but I want to start by walking us through some of those strategies and the evidence of their effectiveness so we can compare them to the impact of school policing. Next slide. So first, restorative approaches. These are strategies to intentionally develop positive relationships among students and staff so that they understand and care about one another, which makes it less likely that they'll harm one another and more possible to repair harm when it does occur. An extensive study has found that when faithfully implemented, restorative approaches really work. Kids behave better, they don't hurt each other or school staff. And I know we heard that SROs are receiving some restorative approaches training, but it's important to note that experts like the National Education Policy Center have found that increased reliance on school police is, quote, fundamentally at odds with a restorative approach. Next slide. A second strategy, social emotional learning, is exactly what it sounds like. It's investing in teaching kids how to be self-aware, how to regulate emotion, how to resolve conflict peacefully, how to empathize with others. And this too has been shown through studies to have positive, immediate and long-term impacts on student behavior, including specifically by reducing violent conduct. Next slide. Third, trauma-sensitive practices recognize that some kids act out and hurt others because they've suffered trauma and are hurting themselves. So trauma-sensitive schools have the mental health services, the staff training, the community partnerships to medical resources, food, housing, to address kids' trauma at its root, mitigating the impacts on behavior. And again, we see that schools have implemented trauma-sensitive practices, experience improvements in school safety and climate. They are safer and calmer for all students and staff. Next slide. And the final example for today, again, just scratching the surface, is special education identification and planning. Some kids have disabilities that manifest as problematic behaviors. So for example, a child with PTSD might have a fight or flight response and lash out when triggered, or a kid with ADHD might be impulsive and jump into a brawl without stopping to think whether that's a good idea. But we have data-driven tools from the special education context to address those challenges. A school psychologist could conduct a functional behavior assessment to discern the purpose of the student's problem behaviors. For example, maybe it's to escape stress, and then work with a school team and the family to come up with a behavior intervention plan that helps address those functions and meet those needs, but with positive behavior. Just a quick example, last week I represented a student with autism who had a history of physical aggression and property destruction. But after implementing his BIP, the school saw a 76% decline in aggression and an 89% decline in the property destruction over a period of just a few weeks. But the bottom line here is that problem behavior and violence in schools always has root causes, whether it's disability or trauma or mental illness or lack of trusting relationships with peers and adults, or simply the reality that kids are kids and are still developing physiologically and learning social skills like empathy and conflict resolution. And when we address these root causes, we measurably improve student behavior and school safety. Next slide. The problem, as a previous speaker pointed out, is that to implement these and other effective alternatives, we need staff. We need counselors, social workers, psychologists, restorative justice experts, community school coordinators, and in Maryland, we don't have enough of these key partners. We fall short of the recommended benchmarks in some cases, and in many schools, the positions just don't exist at all. We are really underinvesting in the safety strategies that work. Next slide. Instead, we are pinning our hopes to the SRO or school police model. And I'll be using those terms interchangeably because as a legal matter, SROs are police with the authority and obligation to arrest and carry firearms. It's often the case that when we talk about school safety, the school police model is the only one we're talking about. It's the only tool we're offering to parents and schools. But the problem is that the model just doesn't work and causes some serious, harmful, unintended consequences. Next slide. Let's start with the school shooting issue, which I know is on everyone's minds. Police presence does not stop school shootings. I can't emphasize this enough because there's a mountain of evidence that demonstrates it based on research across the country over 40 years. In fact, a study published by the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, just last year, found that school police presence is linked to an increase in casualties resulting from school shootings, perhaps because a shooter comes to school knowing that an officer is there and comes prepared, bringing a higher capacity weapon and so on. Let me just say that as a mom of a public school student myself, I'm sympathetic to parents who demand police in their schools following a shooting, because as a society, that's the only tool we've pitched as a solution to these horrific episodes, but it has really given us false hope. And as much as we want to believe that police in our kids' classrooms and hallways will protect them from shootings, that is not the reality. Next slide. And the research also fails to prove that school police presence reduces other types of school-based violence, even those run-of-the-mill fights and so on. Next slide. At the same time, as you heard from Michelle, the school policing model does produce some real harms, right? An officer's job, their sworn duty is to enforce the law, and legally and by training, they are police, and they have the power to arrest and use other law enforcement responses when they witness a potential violation of the law, which means that school officers can and do treat everyday schoolyard fights as assaults or routine horseplay as criminal disturbance of the educational process, itself a crime in Maryland. So that's why in Maryland, 70% of our 3,141 school arrests are for these types of minor misbehaviors. As one example, over 200, I believe is over 280, I think 284 school arrests in the 2018-19 school year. The last year we were in person, for which we have data, were for disruption and disrespect, right? And again, we know these are offenses that are in the eye of the beholder and best dealt with teaching rather than the criminal system. Next slide. And as we heard from Michelle, we also see from the research that school police presence has a measurable negative impact on academic performance, test scores, and graduation rates. Next slide. Again, we've heard that these harms are not inflicted evenly, with Black students and students with disabilities bearing a disproportionate share of school-based arrests. I'll just add that in addition to the impacts of implicit bias that we heard about, Black students are disproportionately likely to attend a school with an officer or a school that has more police and mental health professionals, right? So it's the police that are responding when they get in a fight. Whereas in another school, it might be a different response. Meanwhile, students with disabilities often face arrest for behaviors, even nonviolent behaviors, arising directly out of their disabilities. Next slide. So it's a strategy that just hasn't lived up to its expectations. It hasn't kept our kids safe. It's subjected them to harms associated with being needlessly funneled into the criminal system. And yet we're pouring a tremendous amount of money into it. 10 million per year at the state level, plus another 40 million per year in local revenues. Next slide. Now, it doesn't have to be this way. There are school districts that have successfully reimagined school safety by shifting away from a policing model and towards one that focuses on fostering peaceful conflict resolution, social emotional skill development, and positive student and staff relationships. There's just 2 examples here. And in each case, the districts removed police from schools altogether and instead invested in a restorative model with student services. And both times, the district saw declines in students becoming involved in the juvenile and criminal systems without any spike in violence. And I want to just close with a story about one of my clients. It's one of many, but I'll call him Sam. He's 13 years old, probably around 100 pounds, in middle school here in Maryland in a public school. He was waiting for a school bus when the principal told him to fold up his little Razor scooter that he had with him and put it away. And he tries to explain that he can't do it because the scooter is rusted. And that sounds to the principal like insubordination. So he starts raising his voice and the dispute heats up and drags on to the point that the kid misses his bus, which of course only makes him more upset and more anxious. This is a kid with ADHD. He's very triggered. So he goes into the school to call his mom for a ride, right? Because he's stranded now without his bus. But the principal objects. He goes in anyway, and he goes to the office and he picks up the phone to call his mother. But then he gets tackled to the ground, and a school police officer arrests him, and he gets charged for trespassing. And this kid is now traumatized. He has a juvenile proceeding to navigate with his mother, and he's terrified to return to school. So I think the question is, do we think that in this case, the SRO model kept the school safe? What if Sam's principal had training on how to de-escalate rather than escalate a verbal dispute with a middle schooler? What if the principal actually had a relationship with this student so that his immediate conclusion wasn't that the child was being insubordinate? What if there wasn't an officer there whose sworn duty was to enforce the law and was trained to perceive that entering a school over the principal's objection was a crime, the crime of trespassing? So, at the end of the day, this is really just about the reality, again, that we all want more than anything, all of our students, all of our kids to be safe, and we owe it to them to do what works. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I see 2 questions. I just want to remind the committee before we go to questions, we do have one more presenter, and our bill hearings today have been moved to 1:30. The public has been alerted. There's being a note put on the website, and hopefully you'll have a little buffer to get something to eat. But I see Delegate Patterson, then Delegate Griffith, and then Delegate Lasanti. So Delegate Patterson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I have a question regarding the recommendations as relates to meeting recommended benchmarks. The question is, in some schools, or is there any data to suggest that the lack of diversity in schools, school staffing and administration, particularly minority representation, is that having an impact on what you've described, or I would describe as subjective offenses? the question is for Michelle or whoever wants to answer.
Well, I'll just start first and say, I think one thing, as we've had, I think, more nuanced conversations about racial biases and how that plays out in our society, is that we recognize that anyone can be a part of that and participate in that. And so, you know, I practiced in doing trial work in Prince George's County and saw a lot of Black administrators and teachers implementing the same strategies and reliance on policing subjective behaviors from those administrators as well. So I do think that increased diversity is certainly important, but I think more importantly is having those conversations and those trainings with administrators about how their biases are playing out in the implementation of arrest and discipline as well. And then also removing, again, that reliance on the policing model. Manisha, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, that's great. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you.
Delegate Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for speaking today. My question is, you mentioned there was no evidence that school resource officers prevent school shootings, but we have right here in Maryland, the Great Mills High School incident where a school resource officer engaged a school shooter in less than a minute, exchanged gunfire with an individual and prevented multiple casualties and many, many lives lost. I think that's a pretty poignant example of where a school resource officer may not have prevented the shootings, but definitely saved lives and prevented massive loss of life. Can you speak to that in relation to your data, please?
Yeah, sure. So it's my understanding, and it's been publicly reported, that the shooter in that case was targeting someone he had a romantic relationship with or had previously had a romantic relationship with. So it was really about that other person, indicating that there was not an intent to, you know, shoot up the whole school or kill or hurt other people other than this particular targeted individual. So I don't really think that's a counter example for that reason.
How do we know they weren't intending to shoot more individuals? I mean, an individual who's looking to kill, right, doesn't necessarily, and we don't know, I guess we'll never know the truth of that, but the individual shot two people and still had ammunition on them, right? And the only way that incident stopped was because of the school resource officer. That's the only thing we know factually.
So I mean, I think clearly there's, you know, different ways to look at those sets of facts. Again, I think the fact that it was an individual that was targeted certainly sort of acts as a counter to the theory that there was a likelihood of a mass shooting here. But the other thing I'll say is, just at the end of the day, right, it's the bulk of the data that at this point has been collected, analyzed over the course of decades. And you know, it's in my PowerPoint. I'm happy to share it with you, but it shows that as a general matter, looking at, you know, tens of thousands of schools and you know, a large volume of shooting incidents, there's not been a preventative effect presented by SROs. If anything, there's an increase associated with risk from school shootings when there is an SRO present. And that's really ultimately what's most important when we're making policy decisions.
I would certainly love a chance to look at that data.
Sure.
I'm very curious if that data shows that there's more school shootings in schools with SROs, correlation with the rise in SROs, and the amount of violence in those shootings where schools do have SROs. I'm very curious to see that data and see what the data really says. Thank you very much.
Delegate Lisanti.
Sure, and my question was very similar. On your slide, no reduction in school shootings, you make a very broad statement here that 3,000 schools nationwide were studied and no evidence suggesting that SROs or other sworn law enforcement officers contributed to school safety. I'd like to see that data, and please present that to the committee, because it is in direct conflict with FBI data that says something very different. There's also another very broad statement that you make here. Police presence is linked with a 3 times increase in the number of casualties. Again, that is a very, very strong statement, and please provide your documentation to this committee.
Absolutely, Delegate Lisanti, and I should just be clear. I can email, the committee should have this, or the committee staff have it. There's those lines you're quoting from, they're direct quotes from studies, and they're
I want to see
underlined
the
because those are
study.
they're hyperlinked.
I understand that, but I want to see the study, who presented it, the scope of the study, when it was done, who was involved in it. We can all extract information from studies, but we need to know the context of it. So I appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Are there any other questions? I just had a couple of follow-up questions before we go to our last presenter. So there's been a lot of talk today, and you both addressed kind of criminalizing adolescent behaviors and police officers acting as kind of social workers and as mental health professionals. And police officers are in the schools and they serve as mentors, and kind of this theory of, well, why don't we just throw more police officers in the schools, and that certainly will make Black and brown students feel safer, or should make them feel safer. So I was wondering if either or both of you could comment on that.
Sure, I'll go first. I don't think that it's just limited to Black and brown students. I think ultimately what we see time and again is that a school police officer's role ultimately is to be a police officer, and they're playing that role regardless of how the interaction starts. I think the best example of this is actually from a case in Ray SK, which I know we've talked a lot about as a legislature because of the legislation that has come out of it around sexting, right? But that was the case in 2019 in Charles County, where a young woman, there was a video of her performing sex acts that was being disseminated around the school. And she went to her school resource officer in confidence. This thing is happening to me. I'm embarrassed. I'm crying. All of these things about how she was feeling in response to this video of her being disseminated. And the school resource officer sat there and listened and talked to her and took statements and ultimately charged her with production and dissemination of child pornography. And so this thing that she went to this school resource officer, someone in confidence that she thought that she could trust, that she thought could help her in response to this, what she was experiencing, which as a young woman who was in school during the advent of when pictures and things started going around, I can't imagine that type of feeling. But then to turn around and be prosecuted for that when you went to the school police officer as someone to trust, I think really shows the fundamental breakdown that even when students are relying on school police in this type of way, ultimately, at the end of the day, they are police officers and they do have the discretion to file charges, and they routinely use that discretion to do so. And that's separately, and I'm sure Manisha will touch on the racialized elements as well, but I don't want it to be limited to the feelings that Black and brown students feel, because any student can be subjected to what SK was subjected to in that case.
Yeah, and I can add, yes, I think a fundamental point here is at the end of the day, police officers do have a policing function. If our goal is to have mentors, that's a different goal from having someone who has the authority to arrest and carry firearms in school. There's also data showing that school police officers only spend a very small minority of their time on mentoring activities. So even to the extent that's something sort of put out there, it does not reflect the majority of what they're doing and how they're spending their time in schools. And as for sort of the question of, no doubt, I am sure, and some folks here have cited examples of, students in their district who have wonderful relationships with their officers. That absolutely does exist in certain cases. But what I would say is, a student who is seeking out a police officer as a mentor has every opportunity to do that in the community. There's, many of the departments hold community events, have community programming, and the difference there is if you seek it out, it's on a voluntary basis. And students should have that opportunity, but the fact that some want that relationship shouldn't mean that we need to subject everyone in the school to that particular model that does produce the harms that we described.
Thank you. And thank you both for being here today. And finally, we have Ms. Janine Stewart, who we have to say thank you. Thank you for being patient. This is a very important topic and it has gone on for a long time. So I really appreciate you hanging in there with us. I hope you've been sitting and not standing. But whenever you're ready, we have Ms. Janine Stewart from the Public School Superintendent Association of Maryland.
Thank you so much, Madam Atterbury. I thank you for this time. And I have been patient. I am a former administrator, still present administrator. I've worked in 2 districts in Maryland, the state of Maryland. I want to thank everyone for their gracious contributions to this restorative dialogue today. I stand as a licensed trainer for the International Institute of Restorative Practices with a lot of background and contact knowledge. I am also in school at GW looking to do more research and a doctorate candidate for restorative practices. And I am a parent. I am a parent of 2 children, one in the 3rd grade and one in college. And so I stand here as a product of, a single family household growing up where I've experienced adverse childhood experiences similar to many of the students who are in trauma in our schools today. And so I stand here bringing you greetings on behalf of every stakeholder in our schools, our parents, our students, and our staff members. Restorative practices teaches us to be restorative leaders. And I thank you in advance for your opportunity to, in this moment, be present, be reflective, to be restorative by thinking about the trauma-sensitive nature of what we're discussing here today. I am grateful for the superintendents, the administrators, the teachers, the counselors, the social workers, the SROs, the security personnel, the therapists, the bus drivers, the cafeteria workers who are restorative in their leadership. Because as we know, anyone within a school building can be restorative in nature. I think many of the things that we heard, I do have to take a moment. My favorite part of educational administration was school law. And so some of the things that I'm hearing in this conversation, like hiring, representation, they do matter. Some of the things that we need to talk about is how we are going to collaborate with those different partners that are responsible for the impact of what we've seen in education over the last 20 years. Let's be restorative for a moment. Let's ask ourselves the 4 or 5 questions that we think about when we're talking about restorative practices. What has happened in our schools, US schools, Maryland schools in the last 20 years? What is going to make a difference? What has been the hardest thing? What has been the impact and who is the impact on? This is all restorative thinking, all restorative discipline. I want to thank the Center for School Safety in Maryland for their work with so many. He modeled a tenet of restorative practices, fair process, where we look at engagement. We look at the 12,000 people that were surveyed to determine what the School for Center for Safety in Maryland was going to even put into their training program, right? And so that is restorative. They engage, they are explaining, they are setting high expectations. Restorative practices teaches us to have very high control, but we cannot eliminate the opportunity to provide effective support for all of our vulnerable populations. We heard a lot about Black and Brown students today. However, we know that and recognize that in the last 20 years, we have a lot of populations in our schools, and the research begins to illuminate this, that we need to think about our LGBTQ population. We need to think about all the students who are vulnerable in our school, whether one reason or another, right? And so I'm thinking about the books that I've been reading as I'm researching. I'm thinking about the books that administrators are using in our schools to really expand the work that they do collaboratively with their community partners. I'm thinking about organizations like Lead for Life, who work with Montgomery County and Frederick County to ensure that when we have those incidents, when schools have students involved in a criminal justice system, that they're able to learn from their mistakes. We have the most important aim of restorative practices is the proactive, preventative nature of it, right? 80% of the time, we are making sure that we are doing things with people. That is what restorative practices is all about. It is high control, high support. It is not high control, low support. It is not low control, low support. It is not high support, low control. But all of these things are going to happen when we're in a school building. Whenever two or more are gathered, we are going to have conflict. And the question is that we have to ask ourselves is, how are we going to be restorative? How are we going to be reflective? How are we going to use that trauma-informed lens? So I've talked about the FAIR process. I've used the essential questions that are all restorative, all options for anyone in the state of Maryland, and a requirement based on the bill 725, I believe, that we use restorative practices across all of our schools in Maryland. So to answer one of the questions that I heard earlier about our work in our schools across the state of Maryland, yes, we are the MSDE. I just was on a call recently talking about how we are going to collaborate within the state of Maryland with all of our school districts on our restorative approaches as a requirement. I want to thank Delegate Alonzo Washington for his work with restorative practices and illuminating all of the things about that related to the implementation. The questions that everyone on this call is asking are all very restorative in nature. I want to think about what it means to be restorative and reflect on the core of how adults affect resilience in children. Unconditional love, empathy. Restorative practices teaches us to give feedback, set boundaries, and provide empathy. As we as a country, as we as the state of Maryland, bounce back from this pandemic, continue to experience secondary trauma, I'm grateful to work in the Student Services Department in our district, working with teachers, counselors, training with every single department, community, parent, first grader, high schooler with restorative approaches. It has been an amazing experience to see how our community members, how our parents advocate for restorative approaches. I'm thinking of images based on some of the messages and the stories that I heard today. Well, I'm also thinking of the school resource officer who in our county has a therapy dog and brings it in and illuminates the faces of many of our elementary learners. I'm also cognizant of the impact of hiring and how some of the choices can, have an impact. And I think it was also mentioned earlier by someone earlier today related to how it is important that we have appropriate training for both our administrators collaboratively and our school resource officers. The thing that resonated with me today the most was hearing the number of school resource officers that exist currently in comparison to the data that was presented. I also had to quickly research about the number of articles or research relevance to some of the questions that were asked. There are 628 articles currently in a quick Google search of theoretical databases about school resource officers in schools. So there's 628, 20 of them specifically related to the impact. So I do encourage us to continue to be diligent in our research. I love the thought of appropriation and really spending more money to the research. I want us to be the first state who does pour a lot of money into the research related to the questions that we're asking ourselves here today. And so I want to end with thinking about defective teams and as opposed to highly effective teens, because that middle school teenage year, I think, is the most important. A lot of the research is around middle school and the adolescent learners, although we are investing a lot in social emotional learning across all of our counties, really in that K-2 age. I think we have to think about the middle school and teen that are getting ready to enter the real world, right? How relationships matter, how that mindset of reaction and beginning with no end in mind and putting the first things last and thinking win and lose and seek first to pretend to understand and listen and not cooperating. We need to make sure that we are instilling confidence, competence in social emotional learning and conflict resolution skills. Restorative approaches, similar to the research presented in the 7 highly effective teens, is being proactive. That's restorative. Beginning with the end of mind, that's restorative. Putting the first things first. Care over content. They do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's with anybody, I believe, right? Humans. So it's a win-win situation if we are working collaboratively, using the FAIR process, using the understanding of the perspective that theoretically speaking, the compass of shame teaches us that when we are imposed with any kind of disappointment or not meeting of any expectation, we are going to respond by attacking others, attacking ourselves, avoiding, or with complete withdrawal. So it is important that we continue our research in these courageous, collaborative, restorative dialogues about this topic. And I appreciate you allowing me the time to be here today. I am available for questions.
Thank you. And I see our vice chair has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Stewart, for your comments today and your presentations today. Really appreciate it, and all your efforts and hard work that you put into this subject matter. You know, the one issue that the majority leader brought up was the implementation of restorative practices. You know, at the top level, we're talking about it. At the state level, we're talking about it. At the board level, they're talking about it. Administrative level, not really. You know, it's not really fully being implemented in many of these schools. You know, we have it in policy that it should be done, but you know, I visited one of my schools, Greenbelt Middle School, and I took a tour with the principal, and I asked, "Man, so how's restorative practices going? Like, are you guys using it?" And she says no to me, and I'm just, wow, like we're so disconnected in a sense of like, it's not happening. And you know, Mr. Williams brought up earlier, like we need more funding for these types of things to educate or train our principals and administrators. But you know, if we go back and look at the Kerwin funding within community schools, restorative practices could be used at that training, or those resources that funding could be used for restorative practices. And so we're missing that mark on ensuring that our students have this as an opportunity and implementing in the actual classroom. And so my question is, what is your advice to us, to our school system, to our board? How do we get this in the classroom? How do we get this in the actual school? Because some schools are doing it, but others are not.
Absolutely. As an educator and a former teacher, I think we have to continue to remember the importance of teacher discretion, administrative discretion, because every school system, every classroom, I've worked in over 10 to 12 schools in our Maryland, right, and beyond. And so it's important to allow that discretion, just as we are allowing or considering allowing discretion for the use of security resource officers or security. I've seen two different ways of that being done. The advice that I have is to be strategic in your planning and to also think restoratively in nature. I think about the restorative continuum, which allows us to perfect through the lens that we're doing in my current district with looking at it systemically, right? And so we're looking at restorative practices as not something new, because it's nothing. It's the same thing that your favorite teacher, your favorite counselor, your favorite, as we heard earlier, someone's favorite school resource officer is already doing. It's good people, conflict resolution, skills. We're thinking about the power of yet, right? That's what we're looking at in our curriculum department. We're thinking about our servant leadership. That's what we're looking at in our administrative lens. We're thinking about social emotional learning and the importance of conflict resolution skills being taught in our schools. Something that I thought about in my first year of teaching. I remember being frustrated as the first year an assistant principal in Montgomery County and thinking, why am I not being more restorative? Because I was raised old school where you listened and you did what you were told, period. There were no questions being asked. But we recognize, based on the trauma that everyone has experienced, from our students to our adults, that we need to make sure that we continuously have those dialogues to check in. And so I'm going to end by answering your question in modeling restorative, looking at self-care, one of the tenets of restorative practices, wellness, checking on each other, modeling it as our school district has done with circles with administrators, stopping those formal agendas and sitting down and listening to people that are working in our specialized programs, listening to their needs, listening to the needs of students, staff, and parents, and allowing shared leadership in our schools. I had a restorative dialogue recently in our school district where a parent said, I want to meet with that other parent and that child, and we made it happen. So I encourage all of our schools across the state of Maryland and within our country, which is why I'm sitting behind the world here in front of, to really be restorative in nature and model it. Don't just talk about it, be about it and model it. That's what I say. That would be my advice.
Thank you. Last question, Madam Chair, I promise. We just heard from the Department of Juvenile Services where last year the majority leader had a bill creating a board of education there. But also we have a new superintendent for them as well. Are you or your team working with Department of Juvenile Services to implement more restorative practices within the Department of Juvenile Services and their curriculum? We did mention some of this within the legislation last year about racial equity and also about a little bit about restorative practices. But I wondered if there's a link between what you're doing with the state and what's happening at the Department of Juvenile Services.
I'm not sure if that question was for me, but I do know that organizations like Lead for Life do exist and do have those partnerships. So if they're not, then whoever that question was intended for, I'm sorry if I spoke out of turn.
No, it was for you, Ms. Stewart. But
okay, thank you.
That's fine.
And then
That's fine.
I hope I answered that question. And the other thing I wanted to respond to is 3 pieces of data from the 3 of the 20 articles that I spoke about earlier. Data-wise, school resource officers do lower board violations. They have been linked to reducing or improving teacher satisfaction based on some of the studies that were done. And there's some other valuable information about those as well that we should continue to research and learn from.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions for Ms. Stewart? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Ms. Stewart, and thank you again for your patience. Thank you to all of our presenters today. This was an incredibly important topic. Thank you to the committee for listening and really digging in. We have a little over 5-minute break. We will be starting our bill hearings at 1:30. So go freshen up and I will see you here at 1:30. Thank you.